If you enjoy stories that touch your heart and remind you of the kindness that still exists in the world, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Your support helps keep these true-to-life tales alive. Now, let me take you on a journey that began on an ordinary flight, with a single mom just trying to keep her little boy calm at 30,000 feet, and ended with a revelation that would stay with her forever. The cabin lights dimmed as the engines hummed a steady rhythm, the kind of sound that always made children restless and adults retreat into their own thoughts. For Emily Carter, a single mother traveling with her 6-year-old son, Nathan, the trip already felt like a test of endurance. She had packed crayons, picture books, and snacks into her carry-on, hoping to keep him busy for the 3-hour flight. But as soon as the seatbelt sign blinked off, Nathan wriggled free of the constraints of his seat, his curiosity bouncing higher than the plane itself. The man in the row ahead turned once, twice, his size exaggerated. A woman across the aisle whispered something sharp to her husband, her eyes darting back toward Emily as though she were guilty of a crime. Emily pressed her lips together, gently pulling Nathan back into his seat. "Sweetheart, we have to stay put, okay? We'll be there soon." But Nathan's energy didn't shrink just because strangers disapproved. He kicked his little feet, accidentally bumping the seat in front of him. The passenger jerked forward, then whipped around. "Can you control your kid?" His tone was dripping with irritation. "I'm sorry," Emily whispered quickly, her cheeks heating. She wrapped her arm around Nathan, who now looked more confused than mischievous. It wasn't the first time she'd been judged. On buses, in supermarkets, even at school functions. A single mom was always under a spotlight, always measured against a standard she hadn't chosen. She kept her head down, trying to avoid conflict, but tonight the glares felt heavier. Then, just as she thought the flight would become unbearable, the man beside her shifted slightly. He had been quiet since boarding, broad-shouldered, with neatly pressed clothes and a calmness about him that contrasted with the tension in the row. His voice was steady, carrying authority without harshness, when he finally spoke. "Excuse me," he said, addressing the man in front, "he's just a child. A little patience won't hurt." Emily blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected anyone to step in, least of all this stranger. The man ahead muttered something under his breath, but he didn't say another word. Nathan, sensing the sudden stillness, leaned against his mother's arm and started coloring in his book. Emily turned to the man beside her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking a little. He gave her a small nod, the kind of acknowledgement that didn't demand gratitude. His eyes softened, though they carried a depth she couldn't quite place. What Emily didn't know, not yet, was that the stranger seated beside her wasn't just any passenger. He was a senior Air Force officer, a man trained to face crises with composure, to stand where others faltered. And before the flight was over, his quiet presence would change the way she saw herself, her struggles, and her future. Emily shifted in her seat, still replaying the stranger's words. She wasn't used to anyone standing up for her. Most of the time, people either judged her silently or spoke aloud with no concern for how much it hurt. But this man's calm defense had created a small bubble of relief around her, one she desperately needed. Nathan tugged on her sleeve. "Mommy, can I show him my drawing?" he whispered, pointing toward the stranger. Emily hesitated, unsure if the man wanted to be bothered. But before she could answer, the stranger leaned slightly closer, a gentle smile brushing his face. "I'd love to see it." Nathan grinned, holding up the paper filled with bold crayon lines, something between a plane and a rocket ship. "This is us flying." The man studied the picture with a seriousness that made Nathan beam. "That's excellent work. You even remembered the wings. Do you want to be a pilot one day?" Nathan's eyes lit up. "Yes, I want to fly real planes." Emily couldn't help but laugh softly. "He's been saying that for months." "Well," the stranger said, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret, "I know a little about flying. Maybe I can tell you a story or two, if your mom doesn't mind." Emily blinked again, surprised. "You're a pilot." "Something like that," he said vaguely, his eyes holding hers for a second longer than expected. "But only if you're okay with me keeping your son entertained for a bit." For the first time since takeoff, Emily exhaled fully. "I don't mind at all." Nathan leaned forward eagerly as the man began describing what it felt like to be in the cockpit of a massive aircraft, the roar of engines, the sensation of lifting into the sky. He used just enough detail to keep Nathan fascinated without overwhelming him, painting pictures with words that made the boy sit still, wide-eyed. Emily watched in quiet amazement. Whoever this man was, he had an ease about him that calmed Nathan instantly. It was more than patience, it was a kind of discipline, a steadiness that reminded her of something she couldn't quite name. Half an hour slipped by, the tense atmosphere in the cabin forgotten. Emily allowed herself to lean back, her muscles unclenching for the first time all day. The voices around her, passengers muttering, the flight attendant announcing drink service, faded into the background. But then, the peace was interrupted again. The same man who had complained earlier suddenly turned to the flight attendant, his voice loud enough for several rows to hear. "This kid is still making noise. Do something about it." Emily's heart lurched. She started to apologize again, but the stranger beside her raised a hand gently, stopping her. He stood just enough to look the other man directly in the eye. "Sir," he said firmly, "the child is behaving just fine. You will not harass this mother again." The firmness in his tone sent a ripple through the surrounding rows. The complaining passenger blinked, thrown off balance. "And who are you two?" The stranger reached into his jacket and pulled out an identification card, flashing it just briefly. Emily caught only a glimpse of an emblem, a set of words that made her breath catch. United States Air Force. The man in front sank back into his seat, his face pale. No one else spoke. Emily's pulse quickened, her mind racing. She turned to him in disbelief. "You're Air Force." He gave a small nod, slipping the ID back into his pocket. "Senior officer. But tonight, I'm just your seatmate." His voice softened again. "You don't have to face this alone." Emily's throat tightened, emotion swelling inside her. She hadn't realized how desperately she needed someone, anyone, to remind her she wasn't invisible, that she wasn't failing just because she was raising her son. Alone. And in that moment, somewhere between the clouds and the stars, she began to wonder if fate had placed this stranger beside her for a reason. The hum of the engines seemed softer now, or maybe Emily was simply more aware of the calm radiating from the man beside her. Nathan, who usually had trouble sitting still for more than a few minutes, was now curled against her arm, his crayons scattered across the tray table, half asleep but still smiling. Emily wanted to ask 100 questions, but she didn't want to intrude. Still, curiosity won. "Senior Air Force officer," she repeated under her breath. "That sounds important." He gave a modest shrug. "It keeps me busy." There was something in his eyes. Discipline, yes, but also a shadow, as though his work carried weight he couldn't fully share. She knew better than to press. Life had taught her that people reveal themselves in their own time. "I'm Emily," she said instead, offering her hand. He shook it firmly but gently. "Daniel." For a moment, they simply sat in companionable silence. She traced the outline of Nathan's small fingers resting on her arm and wondered why this stranger's presence felt so grounding. Daniel broke the silence. "Traveling for work or family?" "Family," she said, her tone softening. "We're visiting my parents. Haven't seen them in a year." Nathan's been counting down the days. Daniel smiled faintly. "He seems like a good kid." "He is," Emily said quickly, defensively almost, before realizing Daniel meant it as a compliment. Her shoulders relaxed. "It's just, people don't always see that. They see the noise, the energy. They don't see how kind he is, how much he tries." Daniel studied her for a long moment. "People judge quickly. That doesn't mean they're right." The simplicity of his words struck her harder than she expected. She blinked, swallowing down the lump in her throat. "It's not easy, you know. Doing it alone." His expression softened again, lines of empathy etching deeper into his face. "No, it isn't, but you're doing better than you think." Something in his tone, quiet, assured, unshakably steady, made her believe him, if only for that moment. Before Emily could reply, turbulence rippled through the cabin. The plane jolted, rattling trays and drawing gasps from passengers. Nathan stirred, clutching his mother's arm tightly. "It's okay, sweetheart," Emily murmured, though her own stomach clenched. She hated turbulence. Daniel's hand gripped the armrest lightly, his demeanor unshaken. "Nothing to worry about, just air pockets." The pilot's voice soon echoed through the cabin, confirming Daniel's words. Still, Emily noticed that Nathan was trembling. Daniel leaned forward, his voice warm but steady. "Hey, Nathan, do you know what turbulence is? It's like bumps on the road when you're in a car. The plane is strong, stronger than any bumps." Nathan peeked at him, wide-eyed. "Really? Really?" Daniel said with a reassuring nod. "And guess what? Pilots are trained to handle it. They've got everything under control." Nathan clung tighter to Emily but seemed calmer. Slowly, the boy drifted back toward sleep, his breathing steady. Emily whispered, "You're good with kids." Daniel looked almost surprised at the comment. Maybe I just remember what it's like to be scared and need someone steady." There was more to that statement, Emily could tell. But before she could ask, the seatbelt sign turned off and the flight attendants resumed their rounds, trays clinking softly. The rest of the cabin had already moved on, but Emily sat there, replaying the last half hour. She had boarded this plane bracing herself for judgment, embarrassment, and exhaustion. Instead, she'd found an ally she never expected, a man whose presence seemed to anchor her in ways she didn't understand yet. And though the flight still had hours to go, something told her that what had just begun was more than a passing encounter. The turbulence eased, leaving behind a hush that felt almost intimate. Passengers returned to their conversations, headphones, and half-finished books. Emily, though, found herself studying Daniel in the dim cabin light. His posture was straight, disciplined, yet not stiff. There was a calm in the way he occupied the narrow airplane seat, as though he had long ago learned how to make himself steady even in chaos. She thought about how different he was from the men she had met since becoming a single mother. Most either looked past her or treated her like she was too complicated, too weighed down by responsibility. Daniel, however, had looked straight at her, without pity, without impatience. Nathan murmured in his sleep, shifting against her arm. Emily brushed a curl from his forehead. "He doesn't usually fall asleep this quickly on planes," she whispered. "Kids sense safety," Daniel said softly. "Even when they don't understand it." Emily's throat tightened again. She wasn't sure whether he meant that as a compliment to her or to himself. Either way, it sank deep into her chest. She hesitated before asking, "Do you have kids?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, his gaze turning toward the small oval window where faint streaks of moonlight painted the clouds below. "No," he said at last, his tone measured. "But I've led younger men and women. Trained them. Sometimes it feels almost the same. Responsibility for someone else's future. It weighs on you." Emily nodded, sensing layers behind his words. "I suppose it does." For a while they sat in silence, the steady thrum of the engines filling the gap. Emily thought of the judgmental man in front of them, who had now gone quiet, and felt a small surge of pride that Daniel had shut him down. But mostly she thought about how rare it was to meet someone who didn't just tolerate her situation but seemed to understand the invisible battles she fought. A flight attendant stopped by with a warm smile. "Something to drink. Coffee, please," Emily said. "Water," Daniel requested. As the attendant moved on, Emily wrapped her hands around the plastic cup, the steam fogging her glasses for a moment. She chuckled quietly. "Nothing like airplane coffee." Daniel smirked. "You'd be surprised. Some of the places I've been, this would qualify as gourmet." Emily tilted her head. "Where have you been?" He paused, as though deciding how much to reveal. "Enough places that I've learned to appreciate the little things. A hot drink, a quiet moment, people who matter." She sensed the edge in his voice, the weight of unspoken memories. Combat zones, bases in foreign countries. She didn't know, and she wasn't sure he would tell her. But the gravity in his eyes said enough. He had seen things most people couldn't imagine. Emily sipped her coffee, letting the warmth settle her nerves. "I guess I forget to appreciate the small things. Most days feel like survival. Work, bills, homework, bedtime. And then repeat." Daniel's gaze softened again. "Survival is strength. Don't underestimate it. Some people don't even manage that." His words struck her like a quiet revelation. She wasn't failing. She realized she was surviving. And maybe, just maybe, that was something worth being proud of. Nathan stirred again, mumbling in his sleep. His little hand reached out and, without thinking, Daniel gently covered it with his own for a moment, steadying the boy before leaning back as if nothing had happened. Emily noticed, her heart tightening in a way she didn't expect. The plane hummed on through the night sky, but Emily's thoughts were no longer tangled in embarrassment or fatigue. Instead, they circled around the stranger beside her, the officer whose presence felt less like chance and more like fate. The hours of the flight stretched on, but the cabin grew quieter as more passengers dozed off. The overhead lights dimmed further, casting soft shadows across the rows. Emily rested her head back, though her mind was too restless for sleep. Daniel sat with his arms folded loosely, his eyes steady on the darkness beyond the window. He looked as though he had done this countless times before, waiting in silence, guarding his thoughts like secrets. She found herself whispering, though Nathan was asleep and most passengers wouldn't hear them anyway. "Do you ever get used to it? The traveling, the unpredictability?" Daniel glanced at her. "You adapt. You learn to pack your life into small bags and leave when you're told. It becomes normal." Emily smiled faintly. "That doesn't sound normal at all." His lips curved in a half-smile. "Maybe not, but everyone's definition of normal is different." She thought about her own life. Rushing Nathan out the door for school, juggling 2 part-time jobs, stretching every paycheck. To anyone else, it might have looked exhausting. To her, it was just life. Her normal. For a moment she considered sharing that with him, but instead, she asked, "So, do you like it?" "The Air Force." Daniel's gaze grew thoughtful. "I believe in it. In serving. In protecting. Liking it isn't always the word. But it gives me purpose." Emily let his words settle. Purpose. It had been so long since she'd felt that herself. Every day was about necessity, not purpose. Survival, not direction. She wondered what it would feel like to wake up with a mission bigger than bills or groceries. She glanced at Nathan, his soft breath steady, his crayon-stained fingers curled against his cheek. Maybe her purpose was sitting right beside her, too small to realize yet how much depended on her. The quiet between them was comfortable now, no longer edged with uncertainty. Emily realized how rare that was with strangers. She was used to filling silences with apologies, explanations, or forced conversation. But with Daniel, silence felt safe. Until it wasn't. A sharp voice pierced the calm. The same man who had complained earlier wasn't asleep after all. He turned halfway in his seat, glaring again at Emily. "You think you're special just because some officer decided to defend you?" he hissed, his voice low but venomous. Emily froze. Her instinct was to shrink back, to avoid conflict. She felt the old familiar shame rising in her chest. But before she could respond, Daniel leaned forward slightly, his tone quiet but carrying unmistakable authority. "Enough," he said firmly. "You've made your point. Sit back and let this family travel in peace." The man opened his mouth to argue, but something in Daniel's eyes, steady, unflinching, made him stop. He turned back around, muttering, but he didn't speak again. Emily exhaled shakily, realizing she'd been holding her breath. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to cause all this." Daniel shook his head. "Don't apologize. You've done nothing wrong." But Emily couldn't shake the lingering sting of humiliation. "It feels like I'm always in the way. Like people see me and think I don't belong. That I failed somehow." Daniel's voice softened again, though it still carried the weight of conviction. "You haven't failed. Raising a child on your own is harder than most missions have faced. And you're doing it." Her eyes blurred before she could stop them. She looked away, blinking quickly, embarrassed to be crying in front of a stranger. But Daniel didn't react with discomfort. He simply sat steady, as if offering her the quiet strength she lacked. Emily wiped her eyes quickly. "You don't even know me." Daniel's gaze didn't waver. "I know enough. I know you're stronger than you realize. And I know your son is lucky to have you." Her heart thudded in her chest, and for a moment she felt weightless, as if the plane wasn't the only thing carrying her above the clouds. The tears had surprised her, but what surprised her more was how natural it felt to let them fall in his presence. Normally, she hid every weakness. At work she smiled through exhaustion, at school she stood tall at parent meetings, and in public she tried to ignore the whispers. But here, in this narrow seat with a stranger beside her, she felt something rare, safe enough to be vulnerable. Nathan shifted again, curling closer into her side. She stroked his hair gently, her heart aching with a mix of love and fear. Everything she did was for him, and still she worried it wasn't enough. Daniel's voice broke through her thoughts, quiet but steady. You know, when I'm flying missions, there are times when everything feels like it's falling apart. The plane shudders, alarms blare, and the sky itself feels against you. But the trick isn't to eliminate fear, it's to keep moving through it. To trust that you'll land safely if you just keep going. Emily turned to look at him, her breath catching at the intensity in his words. He wasn't just talking about flying, she knew it instantly. He was talking about life, about survival, about single motherhood and the storms she faced daily. Her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, she just nodded, because she understood exactly what he meant. They sat in silence for a while, the steady hum of the engines filling the space between them. Emily thought she might drift off, but her mind was too alive. She wanted to know more about him, where he had flown, what battles he had fought, what had made him carry such calm strength. But she sensed he wasn't a man who shared easily. Still, curiosity won. Can I ask you something? She said softly. Of course. Why did you speak up? You didn't have to. Daniel considered this for a moment before answering. Because I've seen enough unfairness to know when to stop it. And because sometimes, silence makes you part of the problem. Emily felt his words settle deep inside her. She thought about all the times she'd endured quietly. At work when coworkers whispered, at the grocery store when strangers judged, even at playgrounds when couples exchanged looks. She had stayed silent, thinking it was the easiest path. But what if, like Daniel said, silence was another kind of surrender? Thank you, she said again, her voice firmer this time. Daniel inclined his head slightly. You don't owe me thanks. You owe yourself more credit. The words made her chest tighten. She bit her lip, unsure how to respond, and instead looked down at Nathan. His innocence, his unshaken trust, felt like a reminder of why she fought through everything. The plane rattled slightly as it passed through another patch of turbulence. A baby cried somewhere near the back, and flight attendants quietly reassured nervous passengers. Emily braced herself instinctively, but Daniel remained calm, one hand resting lightly on the armrest, his posture steady. His composure was contagious. Without even realizing, Emily felt herself relaxing too. For the first time in months, maybe years, she allowed herself to believe she wasn't failing. That maybe strength didn't look like perfection, it looked like continuing despite everything. And sitting beside her, this stranger-turned ally, seemed to understand that better than anyone she had ever met. Emily shifted slightly, adjusting the blanket over Nathan. The boy stirred but didn't wake, his small chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. She smiled faintly, then looked back at Daniel. He hadn't moved much, but his eyes remained alert, as though part of him was always on duty, even thousands of feet in the air. Do you ever rest? She asked quietly. Daniel gave the hint of a smile. Rest looks different for me. I don't always sleep well, but I've learned how to recharge in other ways. A quiet conversation, a good book, moments like this. Moments like this. Emily tilted her head. He nodded slightly. Yes, reminders that there's still kindness in the world. That people can still surprise you. Emily's chest warmed at his words. She wasn't used to being seen as a reminder of kindness. Most days she felt like a burden, stumbling through routines while the world looked down its nose at her. Yet Daniel's eyes told her he saw something entirely different. Her voice softened. You don't talk like most people I've met. That's good, he replied lightly. Then, after a pause, he added, when you've been in places where every second matters, where every decision could change someone's life, you stop wasting words. Emily absorbed that, imagining him in situations she could barely comprehend. She wanted to ask what he had seen, but something in his tone warned her not to press too far. Instead, she said, I can't even imagine. Daniel studied her for a moment before answering. You don't have to imagine. You live your own battles every day. They may not look the same, but they take just as much strength. She blinked, his words hitting her harder than she expected. For years she had brushed off compliments, telling herself they didn't count because people didn't know the whole story. But Daniel spoke with a conviction that made it impossible to dismiss. Her throat tightened. You make it sound like I'm strong. You are strong, he said simply, as if it were fact. You've carried more than most people realize, and you're still here. That's strength. Emily looked down, blinking quickly to hide the moisture gathering in her eyes. She had heard encouragement before, but never like this, never with such unwavering certainty. A chime sounded overhead, and the captain's voice came through the speakers, announcing that they would begin their descent soon. Emily's stomach fluttered, both from the news and from the realization that her time beside Daniel was almost over. She found herself oddly reluctant. She didn't want this flight to end, didn't want to lose the rare connection she had found. As if sensing her thoughts, Daniel spoke again. "You're going to be okay, Emily. Whatever life throws at you, you'll handle it. I can see that." She met his gaze, finding no trace of doubt in his eyes. For the first time in a long time, she almost believed it.